He was a ghost made of dust and failure, leaning against her fence post as if the splintered wood were the only thing holding his bones together. The sky threatened a cold, hard rain, the color of a fresh bruise. She stood on the porch, a silhouette against the stark wood of the house, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. She was not a woman you trifled with, she was a storm in boots, a creature carved from the same granite that broke plows in the valley. He had seen her from a distance, heard the stories in the last town he'd drifted through. The widow of Blackwood Creek. Her husband, taken by a winter fever. Her land, coveted by lesser men. He just wanted a day's work for a meal, a dry corner in a barn. He didn't expect her to walk down the steps, her boots making no sound on the packed earth, and stop a few feet away. Her eyes, the color of moss and stone, took him in completely, assessing the frayed cuffs of his shirt, the hollows in his cheeks, the way his hands were calloused but empty. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where he came from. She spoke, and her voice was like gravel and honey, a sound that belonged to the land itself. "I need a man," she said, the words cutting through the wind's low moan. "You need a home." He straightened up, the movement slow, every muscle aching with a weariness that went deeper than the miles. He thought he'd misheard. He thought it was a cruel joke. But her face was devoid of humor, a mask of grim pragmatism. "I don't need a husband," she clarified, as if reading the flicker of confusion in his tired gaze. "I need a back that can lift, hands that can fix, and a presence that tells the circling vultures this place is not abandoned. My boy needs to see what a man does. My fences need mending. My roof needs patching before the snows." In return, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the vast, lonely expanse of her property. "There's a roof. There's food on the table. There's a bed in the barn that's dry. You work the land, you earn your keep. You guard this place, you earn your peace. That's the offer. No sentiment. Just a trade." He looked from her unyielding face to the house behind her. It wasn't just a building, it was a fortress, built to withstand winds and winters and wolves of all kinds. He looked at his own hands, empty for so long. He had nothing left to lose but the dust on his boots. He had forgotten what a home felt like. The word itself was a foreign country. He met her gaze, and for the first time in a year, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It wasn't hope. It was a choice. "All right," he said, his own voice rusty from disuse. She simply nodded, a short, sharp motion. "The work starts at sunrise." The barn is unlocked. She turned and walked back to the house without another word, the shotgun never leaving her arm. The first drops of cold rain began to fall, plastering his thin shirt to his skin. He watched her go, then turned and walked toward the barn. He didn't have a name to give her, and she hadn't asked for one. He was just the man she needed. He was just a man who needed a home. The arrangement began in silence. His name was Silas, a fact he didn't offer and she didn't request. For the first week, their world was defined by the rhythm of labor. Sunrise found him splitting wood, the sharp crack of the axe the only conversation between them. He moved with a quiet economy, a man who had worked hard his entire life, even if life had given him nothing back for it. He mended the sagging fence line along the northern pasture, his hands sure and steady as he stretched the wire taut and drove new posts into the stubborn earth. He saw her watching sometimes from the kitchen window, a still figure behind the glass. She never praised his work. She never had to. The next morning, a fresh loaf of bread and a slab of cured meat would be on the porch railing for his breakfast. Her days were a mirror of his own relentless motion. She moved through her chores like a force of nature, weeding the sprawling garden with a vengeance, canning vegetables in the steamy kitchen, her face set in lines of fierce concentration. There was a boy, Caleb, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was a small, quiet shadow of his mother, with the same watchful, serious eyes. He'd trail Silas at a distance, hiding behind the water trough or the woodpile, observing the stranger who now inhabited his father's workspace. Silas never pushed, never tried to bridge the gap with easy smiles or cheap words. He just worked, letting his actions speak their own blunt language. He was here to fix things. He was here to stay. That was all the boy needed to know for now. Their first meal together at the kitchen table was an ordeal of unspoken rules. She set a plate before him, piled high with roasted chicken and potatoes. The boy sat opposite, his gaze fixed on his own plate. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on ceramic and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was a weighted one, a space where everything was being measured and judged. He ate slowly, deliberately. He had known starvation, and he would never again take a meal for granted. When he was finished, he stood, took his plate to the sink, and washed it. She watched him, her expression unreadable. It was a simple act, but it was an acknowledgement. He was not just a hired hand to be served. He was part of the machinery of this place now. He was a cog in the wheel that kept the fortress standing. The first crack in the stony silence came with the scream of a horse. A summer squall had blown in fast and hard, turning the dusty yard into a slick sea of mud. Lightning split the sky, and in its flash, Silas saw one of the mares thrashing in the far pasture, a leg tangled horrifically in a section of old, downed wire he hadn't reached yet. He was out the barn door in an instant, grabbing a pair of heavy wire cutters and a lantern. He didn't expect her to be right behind him, a heavy blanket in her arms, her hair plastered to her face by the driving rain. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved together, a practiced, synchronized unit born of shared necessity. He calmed the terrified animal with a low, steady voice, his hands gentle but firm on its trembling hide. She held the lantern high, its light a small, defiant beacon in the violent dark, shielding the flame from the worst of the wind. He worked quickly, his fingers finding the twisted wire, the cutters biting through the steel with a sharp snap. The horse, freed, scrambled to its feet, favoring the leg but standing. It was then, as he ran a hand down the mare's wounded limb to assess the damage, that she spoke. It's a deep cut. Her voice was tight with a fear she would never admit to. She'll need stitching. Silas just nodded, his focus entirely on the animal. Get the kit from the barn. And whiskey. For the horse, he added, a beat later. She disappeared into the rain and returned, not just with the medical kit and whiskey, but with a clean rag she used to wipe the blood and rain from his face. It was a fleeting, practical touch, but it felt like a brand. They worked side by side in the rain-lashed barn, Silas stitching the wound with a surgeon's precision while Ilara kept the mare calm. The storm raged outside, but inside their small circle of lantern light, a different kind of quiet settled. It was the quiet of mutual respect, of a crisis met and weathered together. He saw then, in the weary slump of her shoulders, the immense weight she carried alone. She saw, in his steady, capable hands, a reliability she had forgotten could exist. When it was over, he simply said, "She'll mend." He looked at her, and the word hung in the air between them. Staying. He was staying. He was mending more than just a horse. The shadow arrived on a Tuesday. A man on a fine, tall horse, dressed in clothes too clean for the country. He rode up to the fence Silas had just finished mending as if he owned it. This was Jedediah Thorne, a name whispered with a mix of fear and resentment in the valley. He had a sprawling ranch that bordered Ilara's land to the east, and his greed was as vast as his acreage. Thorne dismounted, leaving his reins to trail in the dust, an act of casual arrogance. He surveyed the property, a covetous gleam in his eyes. "Morning, Ilara," he called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. Ilara emerged onto the porch, her posture rigid. She didn't return the greeting. Silas, who had been sharpening an axe blade near the woodpile, stopped his work. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel ceased, and the silence that fell was heavy with menace. Thorne's gaze flickered to Silas, dismissing him instantly. "Getting by, are we? Must be hard." A woman alone. His words were poisoned darts wrapped in sympathy. "I'm not alone," Ilara said, her voice flat and cold as a river stone. Thorne chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "A drifter," he said, nodding toward Silas. "Can't buy that kind of loyalty, Ilara. When the first snow falls, he'll be gone with whatever isn't nailed down." He took a step closer to the porch. "I'm renewing my offer. A fair price for this hard-scrabble piece of land." more than fair. You could have a nice, easy life in town. No need to rely on charity. The insult was aimed at Silas, but his eyes were on Elara. Silas felt a slow burn start in his gut. He didn't move, but his grip tightened on the handle of the axe. He could feel the weight of it, the perfect balance. He was a quiet man, but he was not a weak one. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous men were the ones who smiled while they threatened you. The land is not for sale, Jedediah, Elara stated. It wasn't a refusal, it was a verdict. This is my home. Every home has a price, Thorn countered, his smile tightening. Sooner or later he swung himself back onto his horse, his gaze lingering on the house, on the fields, on the boy who now peeked from behind the door. Think on it. He rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a cold, chilling promise in the air. The unspoken threat lingered long after he was gone, a stain on the afternoon sun. Elara's jaw was tight, her knuckles white where she gripped the porch rail. Silas resumed sharpening his axe, the sound harsher now, more deliberate. A warning. The visit from Thorn changed the air. The unspoken pact between Silas and Elara deepened, forged now in the heat of a shared threat. It was no longer just about work and shelter, it was about defense. It was about holding the line. Silas saw it in the way Elara began teaching Caleb how to shoot, starting him with a small rifle, her voice low and steady as she explained the mechanics of the weapon. And he found his own way to contribute to the boy's education. He started leaving small, intricately whittled figures on the porch rail for Caleb to find in the morning: a hawk, a wolf, a horse. One afternoon, he found the boy trying to imitate him with a dull knife and a block of wood. Instead of scolding him, Silas sat down, took out his own knife, and showed him how to make the first cut safely, how to read the grain of the wood. A man needs to know how to make things, Silas said, his first piece of direct advice to the boy. And how to protect them. Elara watched from the kitchen window, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a strange, burgeoning warmth. She saw the easy patience in Silas's hands, the quiet respect he showed her son. He wasn't trying to replace the boy's father, he was simply filling a space that had been terrifyingly empty. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch steps watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, she spoke into the comfortable quiet. He needs to know how to swing back, she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. The world doesn't give you points for taking a punch. Silas looked at her, then at Caleb, who was mesmerized by a lightning bug he'd caught in a jar. I know, he said. It was a promise. The lessons became more practical. He taught Caleb how to set a snare, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to tell which way the wind was blowing by the feel of it on his neck. These were the skills of survival, the language of the wild country they lived in. It was a language Silas knew well. And through the teaching of the boy, he was teaching himself something new, how to build, not just endure. He was putting down roots in this hard, unforgiving soil, and the feeling was both terrifying and profound. They were becoming a family, not by blood or by law, but by the slow, steady weaving of shared days, shared purpose, and a shared enemy at the gate. The petty aggressions began a week later. They started small, designed to needle and unsettle. A section of the newly mended fence along the creek was cut, the wire snipped clean through, allowing a half-dozen cattle to wander onto Thorn's property, forcing Silas to spend a whole day retrieving them. Thorn met him at the property line with a smug smile, issuing a veiled warning about trespassing livestock. A few days after that, the water from their well began to taste strange, brackish and foul. Silas found a dead rabbit at the bottom, an act too deliberate to be an accident. He spent 2 days draining, scrubbing, and refilling the well, his jaw set in a line of cold fury. Each incident was a message, a calculated campaign of attrition meant to break Elara's spirit and drive them out. But it had the opposite effect. It tempered them, hardening their resolve like steel in a forge. Silas began walking the property line every night, a lantern in one hand, the newly sharpened axe in the other. He was a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness. He learned the sounds of the night, the call of the owl, the rustle of a deer in the underbrush, and the unnatural quiet that signaled a human presence. He and Elara spoke of it only once, standing by the now clean well as dusk settled over the valley. "He won't stop," she said. It was a statement of fact, her voice devoid of panic. She was a realist, forged in hardship. She knew the nature of men like Thorn. Silas looked out toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their land. "Neither will I," he replied. The words were simple, unadorned, but they were the heaviest thing he had ever lifted. It was a vow. It was the moment the trade, a home for a man's labor, was fully renegotiated. Now it was a fortress for a protector. A family for a guardian. That night, she left a plate of food for him on the porch as always, but this time, his father's old coat was folded neatly beside it, a silent offering against the night's chill. When he put it on, it fit as if it were made for him. He was no longer just a man who needed a home, he was the man of this home, and he would not let it fall. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for weeks finally broke. It came not with rain and thunder, but with the sound of hoofbeats in the dead of night. 3 riders, dark shapes against a sliver of moon. Silas was waiting. He had felt it coming, a tension in the air, a wrongness in the silence. He met them not in the open yard, but from the shadows of the barn, the heavy axe feeling like an extension of his own arm. "Thorn sent you to do his dirty work." Silas's voice was low, carrying easily in the still night air. The men, hired thugs with mean eyes and crueler smiles, just laughed. "He sent us to collect what's his," the leader snarled, dismounting. Starting with you, the confrontation was not a dramatic, drawn-out brawl. It was a swift and brutal reality. It was the desperate, ugly business of survival. The first man came at him with a length of chain, swinging it in a whistling arc. Silas didn't meet the force head-on. He moved like a shadow, using the man's momentum against him, and the blunt side of the axe found its mark with a sickening thud. The second man hesitated, and that was his mistake. Just as he drew a pistol, the blast of a shotgun ripped through the night from the porch. Ilara. She stood there, not as a woman in fear, but as a queen defending her castle, her face illuminated by the muzzle flash, her expression one of absolute, righteous fury. She didn't flinch. She simply worked the pump and stood ready. The third man, seeing his companion fall and the she-cat on the porch, lost his nerve and wheeled his horse around, vanishing into the darkness he came from. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. In the ringing silence that followed, they could hear the frantic cry of Caleb from inside the house. Ilara lowered the shotgun, her knuckles white. Silas walked over to the man on the ground, the one who had tried to draw on him, and kicked the pistol away. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He looked up at Ilara, a silhouette of iron wool against the lighted doorway. Their eyes met across the yard, a space littered with the consequences of Thorn's greed. They had held the line. They had taught the world that tried to break them exactly how to swing back. The aftermath was a landscape of stark, quiet reality. The sheriff came at dawn, a weary man who understood the dynamics of the valley all too well. He listened to their story, looked at the downed man Silas had bound with rope, and then looked toward Thorn's sprawling ranch in the distance. "Jedediah will claim you attacked his men on your property," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "It'll be your word against his. And his word buys a lot more than yours in this county." He took the hired man away, but left them with no illusions of justice. The law was a distant, fickle thing. Their safety was in their own hands. That night, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't empty, it was full of the unspoken things that had passed between them in the violent darkness of the yard. They sat before the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ilara cleaned and oiled her shotgun with methodical precision. Silas was tending to a deep gash on his forearm. She stopped her work, came over with a bowl of warm water and clean rags, and began to clean his wound. Her touch was gentle, practiced. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper, not looking at him, "he was a good man. A kind man. He didn't know how to be hard. The world broke him long before the fever took him." It was the first time she had ever spoken of him. It wasn't a lament, it was a confession, an explanation of the armor she wore. Silas didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He understood. He had been broken, too. He just sat there, letting her tend to him, his presence a quiet anchor in her storm. When she was done, her hand lingered on his arm for a moment. He turned his own hand over and took hers. Her skin was calloused, strong. His was the same. They were a pair, forged in the same fire. He didn't say, "I love you," or the words would have been too small, too hollow for the vast, solid thing that had grown between them. He said the only thing that mattered. "I'm staying." She squeezed his hand, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "I know," she whispered. It was enough. It was everything. The seasons turned, spinning the years between them like thread on a loom. The hardscrabble farm that had once seemed to cling to the earth by a thread now thrived. The fences were straight and strong, enclosing fields of healthy crops and pastures dotted with fat, contented cattle. The house, once just a fortress, now looked like a home, with climbing roses trained up the porch posts and curtains in the windows. A new, handsomely carved wooden sign hung at the entrance to the lane. On it, 2 names were burned into the wood, Blackwood and Stone. A testament. A partnership? A family. Caleb was a young man now, tall and broad-shouldered, with his mother's sharp eyes and Silas's quiet, steady confidence. He moved with a purpose, his hands as capable of mending an engine as they were of calming a nervous colt. He had learned how to make things, how to protect them, and how to swing back, but he had also learned from Silas the quiet strength of when not to. He was the legacy, the living embodiment of their resilience, forged by a pragmatic pact and tempered by love. Ilara was still a force, but the brittle edges had been worn smooth. The constant, vigilant tension in her shoulders had eased, replaced by a deep, settled peace. She still worked from sunup to sundown, but now there was a joy in her labor, a satisfaction that came from building something that would last. One afternoon, Silas watched her from the barn as she laughed, a full, throbberated sound he rarely heard, as Caleb tried to teach a new puppy to fetch. The sound was more valuable than any harvest. Later, sitting by the fire, he saw her twisting the simple iron band on her ring finger. He reached out and covered her hand with his own, his matching ring clicking softly against hers. They had forged them themselves in the smithy, plain and unadorned, stronger than any gold. They were a symbol not of a beginning, but of a long, hard-won victory. The sun was a fiery smear across the western mountains, painting the clouds in shades of orange and deep violet. Caleb was gone for the evening, riding into town to see a girl, his future a bright, open road before him. Ilara and Silas sat in the rocking chairs on the porch, the ones he had built for her years ago. The silence between them was as comfortable and familiar as the landscape they knew by heart. It was a silence built from a million shared moments, from storms weathered and harvests gathered, from fears faced and joys discovered. It was the silence of home. He stopped his rocking and turned to look at her. The fading light caught in her hair, turning the strands of silver to spun moonlight. Her face, lined with time and laughter and worry, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You told me once," he began, his voice a low rumble, "that you needed a man." She turned to him, the corner of her mouth lifting in a small, rare smile that still made his heart ache. The fierce, pragmatic woman was still there, but now her eyes held a lifetime of shared love. "I seem to recall that," she said, her tone wry. "I believe I got more than I bargained for." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. It felt as right and as necessary as breathing. "And you told me I needed a home." He looked out at the land, their land, a kingdom built from dust and determination. He looked at the house, a sanctuary filled with warmth and memory. He looked back at her. "This is more than a home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "It's the only one I ever had." She leaned over and kissed him, a soft, sure gesture that sealed a promise made a lifetime ago. The story of the rugged widow and the lost cowboy wasn't about a transaction. It was about 2 broken halves finding a way to become whole, not by changing who they were, but by standing together against a world that tried to tear them apart. It was a story of resilience, of finding love in the most unexpected places, and of building a legacy that was stronger than stone. If stories like this, stories of strength, survival, and the enduring power of the human heart resonate with you, then we invite you to become a part of our community. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the depths of the human spirit. Click that bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Thank you for watching.